I love this version of Philip that's like criticizing Diana for stepping outside the bounds when like that's all he did for the first 10 years of their marriage. But
Arguably
you know,
even 20, so like miss me with that, Phil, but okay. Hey y'all, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
and I'm Dr. Erin.
You are very welcome to our corner of the internet for this conversation about episode 2 of season 5 of Netflix's The Crown. This episode is entitled The System. Sure. Could we call it The Firm or The System? Like, could we pick one? That would be ideal.
I know, like, why didn't they call it The Firm? It was so weird. I was like, and I mean, like, I know he was describing what the firm is as a system, but then, like, say, you know what the firm is. It's a system.
It's a system.
Like, it's just, everyone calls it the firm except the show.
Except this episode,
Whatever.
evidently. So that is not what we're going to talk about on our Monarch moment, though. If you are on our Patreon, either on pub, parlor, or porch level, you have access to a separate conversation every single week about The Crown that we call a Monarch moment, because God, do we love alliteration.
So much.
And this week's is going to be about a small radio broadcast that we heard as Philip was driving into the manor
Kensington
house.
Palace.
Or no, wasn't it like the like random manor house where he finds the carriage and like bonds with that girl? Or no?
No, it's when he was driving into Kensington Palace.
Oh, to yell at Diana.
Yeah.
So about a death in the Northern Irish village of Castlederg. That discussion will be this week's Monarch moment. Why did it happen? Why? What are you doing, Peter Morgan? All of that will be in a Monarch moment. And for anyone who's new with us this season, the reason that Northern Ireland goes into a Monarch moment is that Dr. Erin and I both have PhDs studying the conflict in Northern Ireland. We lived there for many years and still have many, many connections to the province. We're actually heading there in a scant couple weeks. So very, very excited. Shall we crack on with the quick summary? My summaries are always like the bullet points and chyrons. Erin's are so much more detailed. So you should always watch the odd episodes if you're looking for detailed content, and the even recaps when you just want like the blow by blow. So I want to open up with the idea that I didn't know carriage driving was a sport. But we certainly learned that it was during an incredibly xenophobic interview that Philip gives about why he started carriage driving.
Why he is obsessed with carriage driving.
Sure. Then
I didn't have that on my Prince Philip bingo card, nor did I want it on my Prince Philip bingo card.
No, and it was like my body got too like polo became too harsh for my body, so I started carriage driving, and I was like, "Are you going to keep regressing and do fox hunting next? Like, what is?"
Tiny violin, tiny violin. I don't.
And then
care.
somebody interrupts him. Obviously, someone has died. I thought for sure it was going to be Princess Margaret, but because like she dies around this time, like in the 90s. So the Queen Mum and I thought and whatever, they all died around the same time. Anyway, it wasn't. It was the Wean that we met in the previous episode, whose name I do not know.
Leonora,
who has sadly died from cancer. Absolutely tragic. You still cannot make me care about Philip, even with a dead child. I just don't care. So we show up to a funeral. But before we go to the funeral, Diana shows up at a hospital. And the importance of this is that we learn that the doctor, whose name is James, is a personal friend of Diana. And, like, chats with her all the time. Has house privileges. And that Andrew Morton, the famous royal watcher, which is what they call tabloids over there, the royal watcher approaches James at the end of this segment we'll go on to find out that it's because this is what's going to kick off the very famous Andrew Morton book that was published in January of 1992. So we do the funeral. Philip rants to Lizzie about how terrible cancer is. No arguments there. Lizzie says, like, well, and this is pretty much Elizabeth's one appearance in this episode, says, well, you're his godfather, or the child's father, I guess, is his godson. Why don't you reach out and, like, see if you can help? So what happens then with that storyline is that Philip goes, he shows up on a day that the dude, whose name is Morton, very inconveniently for Andrew Morton, like, this is very...
Norton. His is Norton, Norton with an N.
Still very... Too much for me.
Too many. Too
much for me. So Norton's out of town. The wife is around. Philip and the wife bond over a carriage. It becomes part of her trauma healing from her child. They then bond over creating a charity around cancer. All fantastic. She is how he finds out that Diana is doing this book. Other than that, I cannot understand why we have this storyline at all and why we spent any time with this at all, but we did. And then Philip confronts Diana. We don't really see Charles in this episode, actually. Philip confronts Diana with a whole speech about the system. Which I think he is expecting Diana will then not do the book, and instead it seems to spur Diana on even more to do the book, and I'll rewind about Diana in a minute. And then that's kind of it. We do have another conversation between Philip and Lizzie at the end of that storyline, where she pretty clearly figures out that he's been keeping secrets from her forever, and he thought that that was, like, mandatory, and exactly the advice he gave Diana. I, at this point, do not know what Elizabeth thinks Diana and Charles's marriage is. Because the only way it is salvageable at all would be if Diana was the kind of person who could ignore all indiscretions and just have her own and be a public-facing person. Like, there is not affection and love between these two individuals. Like, there's just not. So if it's not going to be what Philip said and advised her to be, what do you think is happening here, Elizabeth? That was very odd to me.
Yeah. I mean, there are kind of the two main storylines in this episode, and I understand why both of them happened, but I don't think one of them needed to happen at all. I think they're kind of trying to make this season a treatise on marriage in some parts, on like what marriage is and what these different humans in these marriages within this system think marriage is. I think that's gonna be a running theme through a lot of these episodes as they lead up to the great divorce, capital G, capital D, and you know, all of these. They've always been interested in showing us Philip and Elizabeth's differing interpretations of marriage and fidelity and loyalty and towing the family line. I love this version of Philip that's like criticizing Diana for stepping outside the bounds when like that's all he did for the first 10 years of their marriage. But
arguably even 20, so like miss me with that, Phil, but okay.
He's grown into his role, as they would say. So yeah, I think, I think the important conversation that Philip had with Penny, Norton's wife, was when he talked about like, what marriage is and, what do you do when people grow in separate directions? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's a statement the show is making about Lizzie and Philip's marriage. He's talking about how he navigated that, like, natural tendency to grow in different directions. Like, that's not, again, what happened or was happening with Charles and Diana. And so I think it's, like, all of these people not in Charles and Diana's marriage continuing to say what's happening in Charles and Diana's marriage.
And the other thing is, this show talks about marriage a lot in the relationship between the Crown and the British people.
Yeah.
And, like, so it's like marriage is an institution, the Crown is an institution, like, these are the kind of things. So Like, I don't quite know what. Yeah, it's one of those episodes where I was like, "What are we doing here? Just exactly what are we doing?"
Yeah, yeah, because like I said, I understood what they were doing. I didn't think it was necessary at all for where they have to go. Like one of my notes I was just scrolling was Philip and Penny are sharing their love of carriage riding. Ask me why I care. Like,
yeah,
what did you want us to get out of this? Because lest you think it was leading to something in episode 3, episode 3 was a bottle episode that had no members of the royal family in it except for just like glances until the final scene that Diana's in. So yeah, that was one of those, especially when I watched episode 3 after it. I'm like, why did I spend so much time with this lady named Penny? Is this a woman that Philip had an affair with? Like, why are we talking about marriage and indiscretions and all of this carry on? Like, I think it's harder now. It's getting harder for lots of reasons for both of us the closer this gets to Diana's death, because that's the part we start really knowing the most about. And so guessing motivations for characters isn't as interesting, especially because we just have more data points than we had before. And I'm like, I don't care. She was miserable. It's like she was sad and lonely and scared and miserable.
Yeah, and I like how like Andrew Morton closes this episode essentially by saying and that is,
and I loved that, like that part of this episode. I thought they did a good job telling that story.
Yes, very good job. And and obviously Philip's a part of it.
Yeah,
but carriage rides,
why did that need to happen? Yeah, it just seemed like I would have rather they just did a whole episode about the Andrew Morton book. Because I'm not sure, it felt very disconnected to have Philip's storyline at the same time as this, even though I understand it's like, you know, he's had to, and like the reason that he gave Penny for like why he was so happy to marry Elizabeth, because he had had such a fractured childhood and he wanted like stability.
There's some revisionist history, kiddo.
Yeah, boy, oh boy. Oh, yeah. This age of Philip is saying some interesting things. But yeah, I mean, that was the part that was interesting. The tapes were like devastating. And we know that's what she said, and we know that's what's in the book. You can see her paranoia. You can see her exhaustion. One of the scenes we didn't talk about in episode 1, but I want to bring up because I think it's really important, is that like they really showed A, how sad and lonely she was, and B, that the boys saw that she was that sad and that lonely. And like the scene on the plane where she's crying and William like grabs her hand, I was like, you know, maybe that's part of it too. I think for both of us, this is a slow motion car crash. I can't think of a different analogy, and I apologize. It sounds crass, but like that, what it feels like, we are like watching what happens to her in slow motion, and we all know what's going to happen, and we all know how dark it gets. And I just, any time that's spent on like things that seem frivolous or that don't seem to make narrative sense, I think are going to stick out more of a sore thumb than they did maybe in previous seasons. I don't know. I'm guessing at 2 episodes in, but
yeah, I think the other thing too is for me, and this will dovetail both into our Monarch moment this week and our conversation about episode 3, is that there was a lot happening in the UK in the 90s, like a lot. And the Crown was involved in a lot of it. Like, this was a really intense time in English history in particular. And lots of, I mean, like, obviously the UK is involved in the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Like, this is kind of the beginning of the special relationship between the UK and the US. And we are leading up to Tony Blair, and like we're watching the kind of downfall of that version of the Tories. Like there's they've dipped their toe into politics in the past and not just the crown. So if you want to keep doing that, my God, the rich storylines. Like
So many.
the incredibly rich storylines of the 90s. And instead of talking about what's happening on the planet in 1991, 1992, I'm going to spend 35 minutes hearing a treatise on the importance of carriage racing. And like it's once again, this show has never decided what stories it wants to tell.
Yeah.
It has never had a cohesive narrative in terms of, are you talking about the history of England? Are you talking about the history of the prime minister and their relationship with, like, because the prime ministers don't just show up to have relationships with the queen.
Yeah.
They also have like their whole other story. Like,
yeah. It's always been big disconnects, and it's so interesting. I was just thinking about, like, because episode 3 is a bottle episode that we will have specific thoughts and feelings on, but he always has at least 1 or 2 bottle episodes this season. Some of them really good, like Aberfan was one of the best episodes the season ever produced, because it was a bottle episode, but it was also about the crown. The bottle episode from season 4 was the guy that broke into Buckingham Palace, wasn't it? I think.
yeah.
Which was interesting, but didn't quite go far enough into talking about, like, the economic tumult of the 1980s. But yeah, I think those disconnections are going to seem more and more stark, because this is more of the history that we're all familiar with, and so we know what they're leaving out. And like the conversation that Philip had with Diana at the end of the episode was very great. Was well written.
Yep.
Philip pisses me off, but whatever. That was totally in character. He
Yep.
believes what he was saying. It was necessary to happen.
That was all Philip needed to show up for this episode.
That's all we needed from Philip was that scene. I think the line where he said people make the mistake of thinking of it as a family when it's a system, and it always has been, was dynamite.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But I don't. I
Like,
know
I didn't
Philip
need the
was
funeral.
old. I know he was old and homophobic and xenophobic and made all of these, gaffes with the media for the last 30 years of his life. Okay. To what end? What was
that's
the bird?
not even one of the worst ones.
Somebody explained to me why the bird and what that meant. He saw the bird distracted him from the carriage racing when he was talking to the Polish reporter, and then the giant bird again flew over Kensington Palace. I'm like, I don't. Is this like that mysterious, like, what was it a couple seasons ago when they were in Scotland, like the mysterious
stag or something?
deer.
Yeah.
Stag, yeah, the stag. I'm like, is this a symbol I should understand? Make it make sense. Yeah, so that was, this episode was 2 halves. One half I enjoyed and thought was necessary, and the other half I was just frustrated and angry.
So let's get to that half that we both enjoyed, which is Diana deciding to do the interviews with Andrew Morton. And I think there was a couple really beautiful moments in that storyline. She acted the absolute shit out of it. I also love the little detail of
phenomenal.
like that guy always tucks his pants into his socks because the bike, like, that was great.
Yeah.
I loved the intrigue of him having to hide the tape recorder and hide the tapes and being the go-between and all of that.
And
that made
like
for
that
really
it was
compelling television.
that it was all for naught as well, because she lives in a surveillance state. And always has done. So, like, the naivete that she thought she could get away with recording those in Kensington Palace was interesting. There were a couple.
Yeah, go ahead.
There were a couple good moments, really good moments that we got. I think for me, one of the saddest, aside from what she said into the tape recorder, was when James came over and said, yeah, he listened to the tapes. He'd like to talk to your friends.
Yeah, that broke me. Like, and I knew it
And
the minute, and my immediate response
Yeah.
was, but Diana doesn't have friends.
She doesn't have friends. She doesn't have any friends. She can't have any friends. And the fact that she was just like, it's my astrologer, my aromatherapist, my body, I was like, oh my God. It was so sad. Those are the only people she can talk to. She doesn't have any friends. She's never had any friends.
Except where she kind of fictionally discloses random things to John Major, but that's rant.
I was about to say, aside from her bestie, John Major, she doesn't have anyone to talk to. Yeah, a couple parts of that just absolutely slayed me, and it's gonna be hard. It's gonna be hard to watch this season in particular as it gets closer and closer to her death. But
we also know that there was a time where she was really happy with Dodie. So we are, I think, like, that's like after the divorce is over, we know that there was a period, like, she was excited to possibly get married again. Like, there was a lot of joy in her relationship with Dodie.
yeah, so I hope we get that too.
Yeah, so that's what's buoying me right now, is that, like, we're not going to see the death this season. I would imagine the death will never happen on camera. I would imagine we'll pick up in season 6 with the funeral. Like, that...
I should hope so.
I don't... He is too in love with Diana, Peter Morgan is, to do anything lurid with her. And so I would imagine we'll pick up with the incredibly famous funeral of the boys walking behind her casket. And Harry's little salute. So I'm glad. So in a way, like, the end of this series really should be her having a decent life, still struggling with the crown and all of those kind of things, but having a boyfriend she's happy with, maybe being in love for one of the first times in her life, truly, like, all of those kind of things. I appreciated that James's reaction to the disclosure of her bulimia, that he, like,
yeah.
I wish you could have told me sooner.
Yeah. And her suicide attempts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, he seems like a lovely man who really is her friend. I was a little bit worried about it because I didn't know where the story was going when he was like, oh no, I'll have lunch with him and I won't tell him anything. And I was like, oh, please don't, please don't. But no, he seemed to truly love Diana as a person and want to look out for her. And I'm glad she had that. And I love that he was like, it's not the first time I've been knocked over by the big white van. And I was like, bless. It's hard to be friends with Diana.
I mean, what this episode didn't teach us anything new.
No.
But what it did was, I think, also ratchet up that she cannot make any decision that protects the system, because she is so deep in trauma of herself that all she can do is act in self-preservation.
Yeah.
And just a reminder as well to all of us who saw seasons 3 and 4, that they knew what they were getting, or they could have known. They could have known what they were getting, which is, to me, actually an important distinction. Diana wasn't a secret. And I don't think they did know, because they didn't pay attention to what they were getting. She looked good on his arm, and she had good breeding, and that's what mattered, and she wasn't Camilla. So I actually don't think they knew, because they made several erroneous assumptions. One, that she would fall in line with this because she'd be overwhelmed by the system and the duty to it and everything else. They assumed that Charles could behave himself. And they assumed that the two of them could figure something out. That it didn't matter. They'd just pluck along like every other married couple. But welcome to the 90s, where people get divorced now. And so I don't know if they did know what they were getting with her, but I liked how Andrew Morton phrased it at the end, where it's like, how do you feel about putting the royal family in crisis? And he's like, they did this to themselves.
Yeah. That was a great line.
He didn't
And
do
I
a damn
think
thing except tell someone's story.
tell someone's story. Yeah. And like, and that kind of, that paired really well with when the first question was, why did Diana want to do it? Why did she agree to do it? And she said it's the only way to get her story out there. And, Andrew Morton is still around, still being a royal expert and a royal speaker, for what it's worth and whatever you want to think about him. But I think he really did want to get her story out there. And yeah, I appreciated that at the end we kind of got his media blitz tour about it and saying like they brought this on themselves. I agree with you. I don't think they choose. I think they choose what to see and what to know all the time in the firm. And I think they chose to see what they wanted to see with Diana, and they chose not to see a lot of the other stuff. And they made, I agree as well, a lot of assumptions about her person, with like about how she would behave in the role without knowing her as a person. And, whether they were intentionally or unintentionally ignorant, the ignorance was what caused this crisis in the end. Because it wasn't hard to get to know her. It wasn't hard to find out the truth about her childhood and how she felt about these things. And I don't think it was hard to see that your son was never going to stop seeing Camilla. But yeah, where we are left at the end of this episode is the firm is in an all-out war, and which would seem like a great jumping-off point in episode 3, but that's not what.
But then we go back to 1949 Alexandria because that makes a whole lot of sense. So
we go back to Egypt. Yeah, but I think that's all I've got on this episode. Continue. We say this almost every episode, that being in the royal family is a human rights violation. And that was made evident by the disclosures in this episode.
Yeah. So if you would like to hear a couple of the things that they could have talked about instead of carriage racing, join us in the Monarch moment. If not, we'll see you for episode 3, in which we are going to be perpetually confused as to why we needed to know this much about Mohammed Al Fayed. We'll see you guys all either place. We can't wait. Bye.
Bye.